A question from one of our students doing our virtual lessons is, I talk an awful lot about shadow and not in shadow. And this student wants to know if I will explain that a little more clearly. To begin with, most teachers teach value as value, as it appears on the value scale. I like to teach value as it describes shadow and not in shadow. And I know value describes other things too, but I think being aware of shadow and not in shadow is a good place to start. So let's go through the parts of light and shadow and show you how I read this, and maybe that will help. So we'll just use our imagination here. We will imagine that we have a cylinder. Cylinder is always a good thing to use for illustrating light and shadow. And so we'll just draw a cylinder. So just a simple little cylinder like this. Now that's nothing but a shape, an image, a cylinder. If we want to see it as three-dimensional, then we need to take into consideration how the light is shining on it. What light? The source of light, often referred to as the source light or the light source. So usually there's a single light, and if we're outside in plain air, there's either going to be the sunlight or it's going to be an overcast sky. There's going to be a light coming from some place, and that light, the way that light's shining, the direction in which that light is shining determines everything. Now, if I look at your painting and I can't tell from which direction the light source is, then you haven't done your job in defining light and shadow. You've only defined images. Let me show you a little bit more about that. So let's suppose here on this particular cylinder, let's suppose that we have, well, I'll just bring it from the side over here. Let's say we have a light. This is the light source, and it's shining from the side. And it's a little bit difficult to illustrate on a two-dimensional surface and a symbol for a light source. And let's suppose that it's hitting directly about right here. Well, if the light is hitting right here, that cylinder is going to turn away from the light, and at one point it's going to no longer be in light. That means it's in shadow. So at that point at which it turns away from the light, and let's call it right here. So this is the point where it begins to fall into shadow. That is called the terminator. And it helps you to know that you don't always see the terminator. Well, let's put it right up here. Well, it doesn't matter where we put it. But you don't always see the terminator. You don't always see the terminator when you're out in nature, but to be aware that there is such a thing as a terminator, you could see a terminator in a cluster of leaves, for example, or you could see the terminator as it would move around a surface of some image that's in the landscape, especially on animals and especially people. So look for the terminator. Well, that's terminator, not termination. Well, let's just fix that. Okay, terminator. Now, why know the terminator? Because that's where the shadow begins. So one thing I like to do before even beginning is to determine where the shadow is, the area that is no longer in light. And I will do a note 10 that where I take a single value and I indicate with that single value where all shadow areas are. So all this would be in shadow. I know it's going to be in shadow. There'll be a little shadow right over here that's turning away from this light right in here. And with that light shining, if I were looking at the, if it were an open container, there would be shadow on the inside. But let's just look at the outside. So now we have this area divided. This is shadow. This is not in shadow. Let's take that a little bit further. What else would we see? Well, then we see within the shadow, we're going to see several kinds of shadow. Now, a lot of people I've heard call a shadow falling on a surface a core shadow. That's not what it is. It's a form shadow. A core shadow is something else, which I'm going to show you in just a moment. So let's look at just the form shadow. Now what happens in the form shadow, as it gets further away from the light, it gets darker. And so we can just very quickly indicate this with a gradation. As it gets further from the light, it gets darker. As it moves around towards the light, it begins to get a little lighter. This is the way three-dimension works. And when it reaches that terminator line, then it will begin to get even lighter. And it gets lighter here. It's no longer in shadow. Now it's in low light. But right here is the terminator line at which it has turned into shadow. Now, a core shadow is a portion that you'll see it on things that are rounded, like you see it on maybe a ball, or on the muscles of a person, or on the muscle structure of an animal, all kinds of things. As they turn away from the light, they'll get a little darker right here, and that is the core shadow. It always gets a little darker right there. Now what that's caused because the rest of the form is picking up light from the atmosphere, or what's called reflected light. And this part where it begins to move into light doesn't pick up that reflected light, and so that's called the core shadow. So we have form shadow and we have core shadow. We have something else too. We'll have cast shadow. Now with this reflecting light, we're just going to have to sort of make up our cast shadow. The cast shadow is the shadow that is cast by the subject itself. So I'm just going to make a small cast shadow here. Not exactly correct because of the position of the light there. Now in that cast shadow, right in here like that, that cast shadow, between the cast shadow and the object itself, we're going to have an occlusion shadow. The occlusion shadow are those shadows in which you have no light. No shadows in which all the light has been shut out. That's the occlusion shadows. You can find occlusion shadows everywhere, where two shapes will meet often. Right in between those two shapes, you'll find the occlusion shadow. Now in the cast shadow always gets lighter as it moves from the occlusion shadow into light. The other part of the shadow business is that the form shadow will often pick up reflected light, so you can look for that happening within that in shadow area. If it's picking up reflected light, you would take, in drawing something like this, you just simply lift out a little bit of light right in here, and you begin to see the reflected light. Now, that's in shadow. So when we're looking for what's in shadow, we're looking for something that's not in the line of light. So we know that it's going to be either a form shadow, that means a shadow that's falling onto something, or it's going to be a cast shadow, that means a shadow caused by something blocking the light, or it's going to be an occlusion shadow. That's a shadow that's totally shut out from the light. Or it's going to be within the form shadow, you might find darker areas that would be core shadow. Core shadow is not always visible, but it's always a part of the form shadow. So, and then within the light areas, the shadow areas are the ones that seem to confuse everybody. But in the light areas, you have what we call halftones, and there'll be a single portion of that light area that will be in direct line with the light source. That's called the center light. That'll be the lightest area of any subject, is where it's directly in line with the center light. And then as it moves away from that center light, it moves slightly bends from the center light, moves away. It becomes a halftone, and then it goes from a lighter halftone to a darker halftone until it reaches the terminator, and at that point it becomes a shadow. So if you study these things, even do some exercises like this, or actually it would be even better if you set up a cylinder or a sphere, a ball of some sort, and begin to try to define the shadows in shadow and not in shadow areas as I have shown you here. Try to learn the parts of the shadow. Learn to recognize them, because that helps you to become aware of them. Now, if you found this quick tip helpful, you might also enjoy our full-length instructional videos. In fact, it was one of those videos that stimulated this question. And just go to DianneMize.com and take a look at what we offer there. And leave us a comment. If you have a question that you'd like for me to address in a quick tip, leave a comment right down there, and we'll put you on the schedule. And there's your quick tip.